Centuries of Oppression. The Road to 1918. Chapter 6. Coal, Canals, Steam and Death. Work which attracted a man's wage continued to be overwhelmingly hard labour until after World War II. Whilst the trade union movement had some influence in improving working conditions for such labouring men from the late 19th century, it wasn't until after World War II that anything approaching modern health and safety at work came about. In particular, the conditions under which many working men toiled remained truly appalling throughout the Industrial Revolution and the Victorian era and beyond. These were the men, recall, that did not have the vote. As an example, consider the British canal system. This underwent a huge expansion during the Industrial Revolution due to the demand for industrial transport. It was, therefore, a key component in Britain's improving economic strength between roughly 1770 and 1830. During this period, some 4,000 miles of canals were dug by hand by men with picks and shovels. These were the navvies. They would later dwarf that mileage of canals by an even more prodigious mileage of railways. The public imagined the typical navvy to be Irish. Certainly many were, but the majority were indigenous. Many were agricultural labourers from neighbouring counties or former handloom weavers who had been rendered unemployed by the march of the machine looms in the Industrial Revolution. The work was appallingly hard, but employment prospects were good. No sooner had the golden age of canal building finished than the golden age of railway building began. The same navvies, those who survived, transferring from one means of transport construction to the other. The Victorian era saw Britain master steam power before the rest of the world. While steam power predates the Victorian and was one of the driving forces of the Industrial Revolution, it was during the Victorian period that the technology was put to widespread application, including on the railways. This mastery of steam power and associated engineering was instrumental in Britain's burgeoning fortunes over that period, both economic and political. Steam power required coal, and steam power gave rise to the railways. Miners and navvies were in great demand, grim though their work was. Between 1850 and 1914, some 90,000 men died in British coal mines. Between 1822 and the end of that century, navvies built 20,000 miles of railroad by hand, including many cuttings, embankments, viaducts and tunnels. There was no machine assistance to speak of, though gunpowder was used in places. While steam shovels existed, men were cheaper. There were 250,000 navvies employed at the apex of the British railway expansion. Given that the working life of a navvy was not over long, the entire span of canal and railway building from 1770 or so to around 1900 must have involved roughly 1 million navvies. Navvies did not live to be old. In any case, few men over 40 would have been up to the prodigiously hard labour. Their squalid living conditions, poor diet and heavy drinking contributed to their short life. But enormous numbers were killed on the job. Particularly hazardous tasks attracted a small bonus, and that was enough for men to volunteer despite the known dangers. No compensation for worker deaths or injuries were payable at the time, so the companies which hired the navvies had scant reason for encouraging safety. Being drunk at work was no doubt an added cause of avoidable deaths, though it is difficult to lay the blame entirely on the navvies. Some companies insisted on payment partly in beer, and it was generally the case that wages were paid in, or next to, a public house conveniently owned by the railway company. As far as I've been able to discover, no one has an accurate figure for the numbers of navvies who died constructing Britain's canals and railways. There are, however, plenty of examples of numbers of deaths constructing specific tunnels, viaducts, or stretches of line. One of the most scandalous was the construction of the first Woodhead railway tunnel. At just over 3 miles, the Woodhead tunnel was one of the world's longest railway tunnels when it opened in 1845. 32 men died of the 400 men employed in the excavation and lining. The death rate among the navvies who built the tunnel, 8%, was said to be higher than that of the soldiers who fought at the Battle of Waterloo. However, it has been estimated that around 200 navvies died constructing the Ribble Head viaduct, on which some 2,000 men were working at its height, which is a higher death rate still, 10%. It is unlikely that the death rate was as high as these examples in all cases, but it is likely that of the 1 million or so navvies who contributed to Britain's canal and railway systems, the order of tens of thousands were killed on the job. Premature death is a male speciality, and not always through rashness, as some would have you believe. The idea of male disposability is more than just a theory. It is a demonstrable facet of history. And if this discussion of deaths at work has seemed like a distraction from my theme, namely obtaining the vote, recall that working conditions and the conditions of life generally were the reason for the common people being interested in obtaining the vote. The common man, and very close behind the common woman, were beginning to appreciate that improving their conditions of life required political influence. Finally, the age of successful suffrage campaigns had begun, though it would start with famous failures.